Hello, I'm the Pink Phantom, and this is my podcast. Join me as I delve into the world of games and gaming, and especially old school RPGs. Together, let's voyage into the astral realm and check out my Phantom Thoughts. Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know if you've ever been interested in playing the current edition of RuneQuest, there is a RuneQuest Humble Bundle out there with 20 products with of course the core books and the starter set and adventures and other books available as well. There's 20 products in total. Right now, it's $18 for the whole bundle if you want to get it. There is a link to that in the show notes. As for the show itself, we've got a call from Jason from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. He's responding to the conversation about having a way of quick categorization on the backs of RPGs, similar to what war games do, indicating complex things like complexity and solo, solitaire suitability. And then we roll on to a different part of the world in the Tales of the Dragon Slayers campaign.
Hey, Pink Phantom, Jason here, calling about RPG categories. So this is a conversation we had a few years ago. Liren from the Updates from the Middle of Nowhere podcast called in, I believe, the Spike Pit RPG podcast show, Spike Pit show, Colin's show. And we also discussed some on the Audio Dungeon. And we never got too far with it because I think the general feeling was it's too variable depending on the game master. You know, I can take D&D and play it as a railroad or a linear adventure, or I can take D&D and play it as a sandbox. So, I mean, if it's everything, then, you know, if I put linear adventure and sandbox and one-shot on the cover of D&D, does it really mean anything, right? There are solo adventures and duets for D&D. So, you know what I mean? And I know I'm twisting a little bit here, but now I think individual modules and adventures could probably have this kind of categorization, but I think it's kind of hard to do for the game itself because it's so dependent on the dungeon master and how they run their game. But, you know, maybe things have changed and maybe there's some things that could be determined. But again, the problem is who makes these calls? And that's where we kind of fell apart a few years ago when we were discussing it, I think. But anyway, interested to see what other people think. And it's interesting to see ideas come around again and again and again because, you know, time is a flat circle. Now, I'm going to let you go, and I'm going to go listen to Evil Jeff's call.
Thank you for the call, Jason. Getting to your last question and comment first, who would do it? It would be the publishers. That's the way it's done in wargaming. And by publishers, I mean whoever created the game, because obviously we have in the role-playing hobby a lot of, for lack of a better term, artisanal RPGs where it's a single person kind of crafting their own singular experience that they're looking for, that they're looking to create. But that's the way it's done in the board gaming world. The people who create the games, and you know, creating obviously the box art and the blurb on the back of the box, they just add that on there. It's just something that's become what's, you know, is called in a lot of businesses the best practice. And I agree that something like Railroad Sandbox will be better suited for adventure paths and modules than rule sets, unless the rule set itself is being designed with that kind of experience in mind. As far as categories go, yeah, that's a tough one. That's something I've been bouncing around in my own head. What kind of categories there could be. I don't think it would be as simple as maybe the 1 to 5 scale that you see on a lot of war games for complexity and solitaire suitability. I think you could have something like mechanic or mechanics, where it would say something like unified mechanic, and then maybe in parentheses D20, D6, 2D20, D10 percentile, that sort of thing, or various subsystems, which is something like AD&D would have, where you have different types of systems depending on what you're rolling for or against. Roll over, roll under might fall into this category. I don't know how many people care about that, but I know, in listening to other RPG podcasts, occasionally a host will mention that they don't really like roll under mechanics, or because they like big numbers meaning success. I think certainly genre, if it's a genre focused RPG, perhaps there could be something like emphasis, or if it's emphasizing individual characters or the party as a whole, or war bands or bigger or something like that. If it's focused more on social situations versus questing versus, dungeon crawl. I guess dungeon crawl might fall under the questing category, versus war game, where it's domain play, that sort of thing. It would probably be something that would maybe be more effective in the indie scene than in games that are trying to get a wider audience. Of course, some of that is mixed in with, the blurb on the back of the book, but you know, could be some things that are, the blurb gives you kind of the intention of what the greater scope of what the game is in the world, and then some individual items that don't necessarily go in that description on the back of the book would be in that box. But yes, I haven't had any great success at coming up with any definite ideas for what should be in there. But I think part of that is to the breadth of the hobby, because we're not talking about what, in the case of the board game wargaming world, is largely a historical wargame focus, and where there are kind of agreed upon definitions, tactical versus operational versus strategic versus grand strategic. And obviously, those things, there's still some gray areas at the intersection of those, but people largely understand if you say this is what it is, then people get that. And come to think of it, just general board games have something similar, because they usually have on the cover of the box somewhere, for X number of players, with a spread of players. It could be 2 to 5, 2 to 6, 3 players, 4 players, that kind of thing, and then age suitability. So there is a generic version of that for generic board games as well. I guess the biggest question would be, is there common enough terminology even within the RPG sphere that this would work? Or maybe would it only work for a subset of the RPG community? It might actually be helpful for defining the different game segments of the OSR. It's that your rule set is based on a BX base, or an AD&D base, or a rules cyclopedia base, or a Holmes base. Though you might have to resort to calling that a blue book, just to keep from using the Holmes name. But I'm glad to hear from you, and hope to hear from other people as well. And now, more from my solo AD&D RPG campaign, Tales of the Dragon Slayers. Last time, we finished up the battle between the garrison at the River Keep and the Hill Giants. So now I'm going to move around to some things that are happening in some other parts of the world. This is some world building encounters, essentially. I'm not going to go blow by blow as I've been doing with the garrison, the adventures of the garrison, the River Keep, because I think that gets a little long, and really it's a little dull if combat goes more than 1 or 2 rounds to be doing it that way. But I have been trying to mix things up, because a lot of times I've largely just been summarizing, and that's what I'm going to do here. So the encounter I'm going to highlight in this episode is something that occurred with the nest of Aspis, or Aspises. I'm still not exactly sure what the plural of that is. They are sort of a bug-like creature with a long snout and multiple appendages, and they're social insect style creature. And they previously appeared in Tales of the Dragon Slayers when I was following the various tribes of humanoids around that had been defeated at the River Keep in the first place, and they had the bugbears from that group had run across them and had been defeated, and some of them been killed, and the rest had surrendered and kind of become servants to the hive. This particular encounter that we're talking about today, initially I thought it was going to be a big bunch of nothing. It was a family of gold dragons. It was a lair group, what I've been terming a lair group, moving into the area that had been depopulated when the Red Dragon was throwing its rampage. And now this is one of the group of creatures moving in, looking for a place to call home. And the reason I thought it was going to be a big nothing was because when I rolled the reaction roll for the dragons, it was neutral. But then when I rolled a reaction for the Aspis, it was very hostile, as in attack immediately. Or the book says roll morale is appropriate. And I was thinking a morale roll was going to be appropriate. But I wanted to, from a world perspective, figure out why would they be doing this? Why would they be so angry? And especially at a group of gold dragons. So looking into the monster manual and looking at my notes from the Aspis, I realized that that during the bugbear encounter, I had put down that in the aftermath of that, some of their larvae had escaped. And so they would be out searching for those. And I thought, well, now larvae are, according to the description of the monster manual too, they essentially look like big, giant grubs. So a group of young who wouldn't seem maybe very intelligent would be acting more or less instinctively. Big grubs to a gold dragon might look rather tasty. So my reasoning was that the dragons had eaten the grubs and the smell of that would be on them, and with the Aspis being like a social insect type, then with social insects, scents are a big deal. Chemical trails and things like that. So they would be able to sense the larva and kind of a smell of death on these dragons, even if they cleaned themselves up afterwards, which I'm sure they would. The other thing I got out of the monster manual was that gold dragons, one of the things they can do is 3 times a day they can polymorph self. And it specifically says that a polymorphed form is usually how gold dragons would be encountered by others. So that got me to thinking that if they're moving as a lair group looking for a home, they would be bringing their treasure with them. And what better way to do that than to obtain a wagon, have a couple of the dragons polymorph into horses, and pull the wagon. Because the only thing that changes with polymorph self is your mode of locomotion, basically, and your appearance. They would be able to use their naturally more, greater strength than even a horse to pull a dragon horde in a large wagon. So this group of gold dragons, again, based on the monster manual, if there's 2, it's a mated pair, and if there's 3 or 4, because that's the most you could have, it would be the young or eggs. And it rolled as 3, so you have a male, a female, and in this case, a young dragon. And rolling to figure out kind of what size and what type. It's an ancient male, a young adult, huge female, and a very young, small, young dragon. I also rolled up that the Aspis had surprise on the dragons, and that the distance, encounter distance, was going to be less than 15 inches, which is the movement rate of the Aspis. So in my mind, the scenario, taking all these facts into consideration, developed that you have groups of Aspis that were out looking for the grubs, and as they return home, they just happen to get there at the same time that these dragons are going through these hills looking for a cave and moving closer to the Aspis cave because they see, there's a good-sized cave there, good-sized opening, and that might be a place they can call home. So it's a matter of, this is the way the timing developed, and the dragons had lunch, and now the Aspis are moving to attack. And these dragons also ended up being spellcasters. And as I rolled for spells, because I tend to roll for spells, and for dragons, I roll to see what type of spell. If they're going to be, I give them access to all the spells: cleric, druid, illusionist, magic user, what have you. And in rolling for the magic user spells, rolling to see if they, which ones they could have, and rolling percentage based on their intelligence to see if they knew them. Actually, themes begin to take place for, well, the two adult dragons. The very young dragon was only going to have one spell, and it rolled sleep, which is the first time sleep has appeared in the campaign. But for the ancient male, I began rolling, and he was getting access to a lot of what you would consider combat spells: magic missile, silence, 15-foot radius, lightning bolt, ice storm. In fact, he got all the biggies: lightning bolt, ice storm, fireball, chain lightning. While the adult females started getting more restraining spells: charm person, web, slow. So when the time came and they ended up rolling up, a druid spell or cleric spell here and there, I was picking based mainly on those themes. So for the ancient male, I picked flame strike, for example, when for that level of spell, he rolled a cleric spell. And I did give him heal because I thought the ancient male would want to have at least one spell to aid his family if they were injured badly. The young adult huge female, I gave hold person and entangle. So the die rolls plus the books plus information from that I previously had for the Aspis, it all kind of came together. So here's what happened. I also, for the different groups, there were 3 different groups of Aspis, because I've rolled up different groups of Aspis because it talks about in the book they had these different chambers, and so they have different roles within the hive essentially. And so I rolled groups for each one because it's 2 to 20 on the encounter group, which would be kind of smallish for a social insect group. But when you take into account all the different possibilities of egg chambers and food chambers and groups for scouting and things like that, you get a larger group. You get larger numbers. So these 3 groups that were scouting, I rolled a different kind of weapon for each one of them. The ones that were guarding the entrance, I had rolled hand axes for the bugbear encounter. One of these groups got battle axes, and the other 2 groups rolled up types of pole arms. One of them was a bill, and it's one of those double word. Both of them actually are double word pole arms. And the second word, I don't know how to say. When I've tried to find the pronunciation, I've heard multiple different pronunciations. So one of them is bill. It's either Gooey's arm or Gizarm are the most common most common pronunciations I've heard. And the other group had glaive, Gooey's arm, or Gizarms, depending on how you choose to say it. If anyone out there knows how to say it, let me know. But anyway, they're pole arms, which would give them reach. So based on the fact that these would be it would look like a couple of horses on a wagon with a human pulling a wagon with a human on the wagon, I decided that the battle axes could only get at the horses because of the length of their weapon. Some of the pole arms could poke into the wagon, and some of the pole arms could poke the horses, quote unquote horses. They wouldn't be able to get between the horses, so they'd be limited to attacking 5 from on each side. So, first surprise round, because I got 2 surprise rounds out of the surprise roll. Actually, both surprise rounds, they rolled very well for attack, and they rolled pretty well for damage. Now, with dragons, you don't roll for hit points. The hit points is based on their age. So the very young and their size. So the sizes, potential sizes for Gold Dragon are 10, 11, and 12. Since the very young dragon was small, that was 10. The huge female is 12, and the ancient male was 11. And then the age determines how many points per die. Unfortunately for the very young dragon, it's just 1 point per hit die. For the female, it was 4 being a young adult. And then for the male, because it's ancient, it was 8. So the ancient male had 88, the young adult female 48, and the very young small dragon had 10. Well, they killed the very young dragon, and they badly injured. Well, no, they outright killed on the second round the young adult huge female, and they had actually knocked the ancient male down to 32 hit points out of 88. And then the Aspis won initiative on the first round of combat after the 2 surprise segments. And I guess I should mention they charged to attack during that first surprise segment, which is why they were able to attack and move at the same time, since they were, even though they were some distance away when they encountered them. So then their hot rolling failed them. They only managed to get out of the group, because some of them moved over, obviously, since the others were dead, to try to get a few more attacks in on the male, who was still a horse at that time. And even with all the attacks they got, I ruled that they could pretty much get around him, and they had battle axes, so they had pole arms, so they could attack from the second level. Even with all the attacks they got on this creature, they only managed to get 3 hits. And that is actually what took him down to 32. It wasn't just the surprise segments, it was that as well. And then the damage wasn't great either. The one battle axe hit rolled a 1 for damage. So now, based on morale, at this point, that male dragon should have surrendered. But again, going to the books, and I always default to the books first, says that when a dragon's mate or young are threatened, they will immediately respond. They will go to defend the mate. If a young dragon is threatened, they will immediately breathe. Well, now this dragon is in a polymorph form. So the first thing that this dragon did, it wasn't going to roll morale. It was going to have that reaction before it had to roll morale. And so it polymorphed. Now, when you go back to your original form in polymorph self, you gain 1 to 12 hit points. And this takes 5 segments. And I just realized, looking at my notes, I got it backwards on round 1. The dragon won initiative. But the polymorph transmutation takes 5 segments. But I ruled that if he had a spell that he could do in the remaining segments, he could do that. And wouldn't you know it, heal takes 1 segment. And heal gives you back all your hit points except for D4. But then, of course, I looked to the weapon speed factor. And based on the weapon speed factors, none of those weapons were going to be able to hit before that spell went off. Even with the 5-segment polymorph taking place first. So the D4 the dragon rolled was a 1. So it was back up to 87 hit points. And then they got all their hits in, but they only took 11 points off. No, 9 points. No, 11. 11 points off that 87 to get him down to 76 hit points. I also ruled that since polymorph plus heal only took 6 segments out of the 10 for the round, that the dragon would start trying to fly. So it'd just be getting its wings stretched out and getting ready to try to get off the ground. Round 2, the Aspis won then, and they got some good licks in on that one. They really knocked him down. But part of that is because the dragon itself is 50 feet long. So the polymorph spell, the dragon kind of unfurls, probably smashes the wagon to pieces, but that enables all the Aspis to get adjacent to it, because these are medium-sized creatures. And the monster manual says against dragons, for each 3 feet of length, each 10 feet of length, you can get 3 medium-sized creatures adjacent to a dragon. So they were all able to get adjacent to it either directly or because they were using pole arms from the second rank. They got some good licks in. Again, they had some pretty good attack rolls. They were hitting on 15. They're 6 hit dice creatures versus the -2 armor class of the dragons. They were still hitting on 15 or better, but that would be roughly a quarter of them hitting, and they hit on almost half hit. And they got the dragon back down to 32 hit points. And then that, of course, is when things turned, because the dragon, on its part of second round, went up in the air, and Aspis specifically says in the monster manual they don't use bows. So the only weapons that they would have for range would be thrown weapons, which is not going to affect a dragon that's 90 feet in the air. And so now I envision that kind of up in the hill, the guards are seeing this. They're summoning help from deeper in the nest to get more Aspis in. But again, they're not going to be able to bring any bows to bear. But as usual, I roll for treasure to see if intelligent creatures have treasure they can use. And there is something that they can use. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Round 3, the Aspis won again, but they couldn't do anything. And the dragon breathed on them. And because they were all compacted attacking the dragon, they were all within the cone of this fire breath. And 12 of the 25 failed. They had 29 hit points. So since in AD&D, dragon's breath does damage of its hit points, 32 is greater than 29. So more than half of them died. And at this point, that group of Aspis failed their morale check. So now the dragon uses his fireball spell to finish them off. About that time, the next group of Aspis came out, and one of them had a wand of fireball. No, I'm sorry, I'm getting this backwards again. The dragon killed the initial group of Aspis with a flame strike. But this other group of Aspis fire off a fireball. It only does 12 points of damage. Part of that is because since the dragon uses a fire breath, it resists some of that damage. And then the dragon hit them with a fireball, and most of them died, and the rest surrendered. And the dragon finished them off with an ice storm. So at this point, you have this wounded, enraged dragon. Its mate and child are dead. So what I decided was it would go into the Aspis cave, the Aspis lair, seeking revenge on any that were left. And it talks about Aspis, in the books, it talks about Aspis have a central chamber and all these chambers off of it. So the dragon was either able to wiggle its way in there or polymorph to a form that could go in and then repolymorph back into the dragon and use its chlorine breath to just basically invest the entire nest. And this is where things got interesting, because the Aspis were going to have to do a double save in order to survive, except for the cow, which is a large Aspis. It's basically the brood mother of the Aspis. Well, the cow hit both saves. So it managed to survive with 21 of its own hit points intact, because it's a big 10 hit dice creature. It's not 6 like the others. So what I pictured was this cow, which is probably it mentions that the young eat in kind of pits of material that the other Aspis gather. So the cow probably does something similar, because they bring in food for it as well. So in one of these side chambers, kind of lurking, is this cow. The cow has low intelligence, but it's not unintelligent. It's not even just animal intelligence. So it has, it's cunning, essentially. So I rolled to see if this cow could get surprise on this dragon. If it would essentially, kind of play dead, and the dragon would think all the others are dead, so this thing is dead as well, and get it by surprise. But I only gave it 1 in 6 chance, and it rolled the 1. So I pictured this dragon. It's breathed chlorine breath. It's looking at everything that's died. It's poking around the cavern, and it's kind of a cramped space for it. And so this cow waits for its opportunity, lunges out, and attacks. And it successfully hits. And it does 14 points of damage, which is not enough to kill the dragon, but gets it down to 6 hit points. So now it looks like it's probably coming down to the final round, because the dragon's down to 6 hit points. This cow is down to 21. This dragon is going to have a much easier time of hitting it than it's going to have of hitting the dragon. But if it does hit the dragon, it can probably do enough damage to knock down that 6 hit points. So I rolled initiative. It was simultaneous initiative. So I looked at what would the dragon do. The dragon has magic missile. It's an 11th level creature. So you get one initial missile, and then one missile for every 2 levels above first. So you've got 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, 9th, 11th. 7 missiles. Dragon cast magic missile. The cow attacked and hit. The dragon rolled up 21 points of damage versus the 21 that the cow had. And the cow did 13 points of damage versus the 6 points the dragon had. So you have a situation where the magic missiles all hit this cow, and with its dying breath, essentially, it chomps the dragons and rips the dragon's throat out. So I am not giving this battle enough justice with my description here, especially with having to backtrack and correct myself. But it was just this back and forth of, good luck, bad luck, being able to take out 2 of the dragons initially, the other dragon getting to a space where they can't do anything to it, doing a little more damage to it, the dragon wiping out its attackers, going in to finish off the hive, and then falling prey to the last aspis as the last aspis itself dies. The mother defending its nest. So just utter carnage, and 2 vast groups of a vast group of creatures, because the bugbears came out with the group that came from the inside the nest that was the second group the dragon encountered. So they all got wiped out as well. Just incredible battle, and the kind of thing that you don't see coming until the dice do, because to me on paper it looked like gold dragons versus the aspis was just a mismatch. And when the dice said that the aspis attack, I was like, oh no. But then looking at what these gold dragons are and what they do and how they would be encountered, looking at what the aspis are and how they're organized, it was just amazing. So that's it for Tales of the Dragon Slayers for this week. If you prefer summaries over blow by blow, if there's something else you think would be a better way to deliver kind of these pieces, do you like the world building? Would you rather just go back and follow the Dragon Slayers themselves and what they're doing? Give me some feedback. Let me know. The opening theme of this podcast was Strength of the Titans, and the closing music is Late Night Radio, both from Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. If you have any thoughts or feedback, you can get in touch with me by leaving me a voicemail on my Google Voice number, 864-209-1441. That's 864-209-1441. Or through SpeakPipe at www.speakpipe.com/Phantom Thoughts. That's www.speakpipe.com/Phantom Thoughts. Or you can send me a message or an audio file on Discord, where I can be found the Pink Phantom, or through email, phantomthoughtspodcast@gmail.com. That's phantomthoughtspodcast@gmail.com. I don't have to play or read your feedback on the podcast if that is not your preference. Just let me know.